All right, yeah, we're going to touch on a few topics here today. We've gone through quite a bit up to this point. The new information is really to kind of help you settle in a little bit on your threshold choices, and also to present the mitigation options that you have available in a place like Butte County. And the way we're going to walk through the threshold options is really to let you look at some case studies. These are projects that you've previously reviewed, and to give you an idea of kind of how the 743 analysis process might work. And then we'll talk about those mitigation options, and then we'll demo the screening tool for you. This just highlights what Brian was alluding to here. This is our last stakeholder meeting. So hopefully all the questions that you have left, you can get them answered today. There is a final meeting, though, the BCAG board acceptance meeting, where we will do an overview summary. So let's jump into this whole concept of VMT impact screening. So one of the things I want to make sure everyone understands about this process is that if you're used to the old paradigm with vehicle level service, we really didn't have a screening process other than a few jurisdictions might have used something like a small project trigger. Like your project had to generate at least 100 daily trips, otherwise you didn't study it. But if you decided to study it, you did a complete analysis. What OPR set up in their technical advisory was this concept that you could apply a VMT impact screening process where what you're trying to do is generate sufficient information to make a presumption that the project will have a less than significant VMT impact. So the benefit of going through this process is that it's quick. The idea is you just have enough information to support that presumption, and then you can move on. And if you don't get screened out, you do have to do a complete analysis. And you can think of this a little bit like a teeter-totter. Anything in CEQA that is screening based and goes quick means that you don't have a complete analysis and you don't have substantial evidence to support everything you're doing. You have some evidence to support what you're doing, but that's its weakness. On the other end of the teeter-totter, if you do a complete analysis, well, now you have all the evidence you need to justify your impact conclusions, but it took a lot more time and effort. So that's what we're trying to do here, is work on both ends of the teeter-totter. And the impact screening that OPR laid out, there's actually 5 potential tests. We're going to talk about each of those. There's really 4 that apply in Butte County, so we'll talk about those the most. The first one is small projects. The idea here, a small project is one that's estimated to generate fewer than 110 daily vehicle trips. OPR came up with this number tied specifically to the CEQA exemptions for small projects. Basically, you can have up to 10,000 square feet in an urban area of non-residential land use that fits within the CEQA exemptions. And so that 10,000 square feet, if it's office or industrial, can calc out to about 110 daily vehicle trips. So that's a number that they feel is substantiated by the exemptions that are already allowed in CEQA. The second one, this idea that there are areas that already generate below threshold VMT. So these tend to be your urbanized infill areas. They're already low VMT generating. And the idea is if you put more land use there, it should also perform similarly to what's on the ground today. Now, they did set this up just for residential and office projects. They did not provide a provision to say this applies to all types of land uses in these areas. And that's a legitimate question for lead agencies to decide for themselves if other types of land uses in these areas deserve the same type of screening. And I think that's something we can maybe talk about during Q&A. OPR also identified affordable residential development that's 100% affordable units as qualifying. This one, they have a little bit of substantial evidence to support. But this is one we'll give you a little bit of a warning on. We've done some trip generation analysis of affordable housing projects versus market rate housing projects in the same community. And affordable housing projects did not always generate fewer vehicle trips than the market rate housing. There's a variety of reasons for that. So this one comes down to substantial evidence. What evidence do you have that affordable housing projects in your particular jurisdiction generate VMT at a rate that's less than the market rate housing? And also some evidence that market rate housing would be below the threshold. So those are a couple of questions you got to be able to answer. The final one here, local serving retail. This is a fun one. OPR has suggested that typically this is local serving retail that is less than 50,000 square feet. Working up and down the state, we've been in communities that are a little bit more isolated. Paradise might be a good example here, where even if you built a 60,000 square foot retail type land use, it's going to be local serving. It's not really intended to attract regional trips from other parts of the county. So the square footage here is a little bit arbitrary. The idea, though, is that if you're putting in retail uses into your community, intending to serve that local community, and it makes those shopping trips more convenient or shorter distance, in other words, that might be grounds to justify that the project could have a net reduction on VMT. There's a lot of other local serving uses, though, that other communities have decided that are also worthy of this type of screening. Think about things that aren't necessarily retail, small medical office building, for example, maybe a dentist office, even public schools and public service buildings. They're intended to be local serving should they get this same type of treatment. And then the final screening test that doesn't qualify here in Butte County is this idea that projects within what's called a transit priority area. Now, the reason it doesn't apply in Butte County is the state has very strict definitions of a transit priority area. It's this half-mile radius around either a rail or a ferry station, or basically fixed route bus transit service that has at least peak 15-minute headways in both the morning and evening peak hours, and ideally where you have at least two different routes intersecting. So that type of frequency is not yet available in Butte County. However, I did want to point out something that I think is important to consider. The state's providing this as guidance. It's not necessarily gospel. It's not the final word, if you will, on the approach to your VMT impact analysis. And in the RTP-SES, there is plenty of information about basically transit priority areas in places like Chico that maybe they don't quite meet the state's definition, but this is some of the most urbanized space in the county with some of the best transit service for a county of this type. And so this is evidence that this type of area may be worthy of that same type of screening treatment. You're achieving all the basic objectives of 743 by encouraging development in this type of area. So this might be sufficient grounds to justify that type of screening treatment. These are some of the discretion that lead agencies have. So we don't want you to take the technical advisory from OPR as if that's the only way that you can look at this VMT impact question. So let's go to the case studies here quickly. We had 4 in our scope, and you guys nominated more than 4, but I think you can get a sense of how things played out with the 4 that we did look at. And the way we approach these types of screening processes with any type of project is there's multiple steps that you go through. Ideally, you go through the screening step first to see if you've got substantial evidence to support not having to do a complete analysis. So in the 4 projects here, this is them mapped on what is the low VMT area map that we showed you guys before, and this is for the residential VMT metric. And so you can see we've got 3 projects around Chico here. There's one, it's kind of hard to see maybe, but it's right here near the center of Chico. One out here on the outside, Stonegate, which is a little bit larger mixed use project, and then another project down here outside any low VMT area, outside Oroville. So this is a type of quick screening. You know, are you in a low VMT area or not? You might remember last time we talked about that we have these green zones, but we have some of them hashed. So this is data from the BCAG RTP-SES model. And so when you see a hashed area, it's our way of telling you that, hey, this is just a warning that this area may not be as green as it looks. Traffic analysis zones are drawn for a variety of reasons, and they're not really drawn for the purpose of VMT impact screening. So even though you might have a zone here that's all green, it might be green because it only has development up in like one little quadrant of the TAZ, but the TAZ shape is big enough that it covers a much larger area. So we want to be careful of applying that type of screening if it's not appropriate. So we've gone through the model, gone through the underlying land use context to highlight any zones that we thought deserve special checks when you apply this type of screening. The basic summary that's in the memo shows you the different ways to screen by these different types of tests, the 4 that we had here, and by the separate types of land uses. What was unique about what you guys recommended for these case studies is we had 2 that were mixed use projects. And what's challenging about mixed use projects is the way the technical advisory was set up is that you have to screen by individual land use types. You don't screen the whole project necessarily unless it's a small project. And if you think about the idea of screening and this presumption of less than significant impacts for VMT, it really is designed for small projects. So I should probably talk about case study 3 and 4 first. These are both small residential only projects, and they're in low VMT areas. So even though they generate slightly more than that 110 daily vehicle trips, they do pass the low VMT area test. And all you have to do is pass one of these tests to have that evidence to support your presumption of less than significant. The fact that it didn't pass something like the small project test, that's other evidence though you should consider, should think about as to whether or not the project does warrant that screened out presumption of less than significant. Going back to the 2 bigger projects where we have this mix of land uses, one of the things that you'll find is sometimes everything will fail, and that makes your decision about what to do next pretty easy. Basically, you can go ahead and move forward with a complete analysis, and we'll talk about those steps in a minute. But there's one thing I want to draw your attention to here. One of the uses in Stonegate was a park. It's about 2.6 acres, as I recall, but intended to be local serving. You know, the technical advisory doesn't call out parks as a specific land use that gives you any guidance, but I would argue that it potentially qualifies as local serving. So we did kind of note that here, that project land use specifically, potentially has the opportunity here to help reduce VMT by giving people a close recreational opportunity. So even though under the technical advisory test it doesn't screen, this could be something that a lead agency, you may just decide in your community that a park, a local serving park in particular, does qualify. Now in the second case study here, something unique about this one is that it does have local serving retail, and it did pass that particular test. So here you have part of the project passing, but 2 parts that fail. So what do you do next? And this gets to the, well, do you have to do a complete analysis, and what might that look like? So there's 2 ways of going about this. One option is you try to mitigate the VMT just for the residential units. So that could be something that you do as a independent analysis from the screening tool I'm going to show you in a little bit. We provide you information to know what the VMT generation is for those land uses. But at that point, you need to decide, can I mitigate it back to where it would pass the threshold test? Or do I need to actually, run additional models and those kinds of things? And that's your second option, is you can take the whole project and analyze it through the BCAG RTP SES model to produce all the different VMT metrics that you might need for a complete analysis. So I'm going to keep going here. We'll get through the presentation pretty quickly so you guys can ask lots of questions. So that's the case studies. Pretty straightforward. And as you saw, we had some projects that didn't pass. So we're going to have to probably think about mitigation. And when you think about mitigation for VMT impacts, probably the most difficult thing that lead agencies struggle with is, what is a feasible mitigation measure? And the CEQO guidelines do provide us a definition of feasibility. And here it is. So lots of things for you to be thinking about of whether or not a particular strategy is going to be feasible for your jurisdiction. Now, one of the aspects of VMT mitigation that's a little bit unique is that there's different ways to think about mitigation on-site versus off-site for projects. And so that is something that we didn't deal with a lot under the level of service regime that I was mentioning before. you know, if you think about your level of service impact, they always happened at those intersections or roadways away from the project. So almost all your mitigation was focused away from the project site. Here, we're trying to find a way to actually reduce the vehicle trip generation or the vehicle trip lengths for the project site. Sometimes there's actions you can take that affect the built environment, either of the project site or even around the project site. So there's both an on-site and off-site option here. Same thing for transportation demand management. There are things you can do to help reduce the trips from the site through these program type approaches. You might also be able to apply these at a larger scale. So again, you have an on-site or off-site option. When we deal with the CEQA attorneys on questions like, well, which one should we use? Which one's best? They typically advise us to try and mitigate on-site first, unless there's a mitigation program that's already available for the project to participate in. So keep that in mind. Now, this definition of feasible, things that we have to think about, key limitations. If we're trying to change the built environment of the project, what that typically means is the land use density of the residential, the land use diversity, the mix of uses, things like distance to transit stops. These are physical in nature. Well, when an applicant proposes a project, they're not really looking for the lead agency to tell them how to change their project. They've worked with, you know, the local real estate experts, their real estate economists, to come up with a pro forma for that project and its land uses that works for that particular market. They're not really excited when they have to talk to someone like me to talk about changing their project to mitigate its VMT impact. And oftentimes things that we might suggest just aren't going to be feasible economically to the applicant. And then a big challenge with transportation demand management is that it's completely dependent on the performance of future building tenants that can change from year to year. Think about an office building. You know, office building tenants can change all the time without the city or county having any control over that switch. There might be some tenant improvements, you know, building permit that gets pulled, but you really don't control the tenants in the building. It could go from a dentist one day to a lawyer's office the next day. So we can't give you a whole lot of certainty that if you implement TDM, that it'll work. There's a range of effect, and the range actually starts at 0. And so we don't have evidence that says what's more likely, a 0 effect or a 3% reduction. And that's one of the challenges of relying on this type of mitigation. So in the mitigation memo, what we tried to do is sort through all the various strategies that are available and break them down between what's available at the community scale and what's available for a project site. And we've updated the research that's in the document shown on the right side of the screen here. That was the CAPCOA Greenhouse Gas Mitigation Measures Handbook. We helped to prepare that back in 2010. We've updated all the research for that document. There's a new CAPCOA document coming out here shortly this year. And we've also updated the research for a separate ARB project. It's the Net Zero Buildings Feasibility Study. So we do have a lot of new information. Unfortunately, it doesn't overcome the TDM limitations I just talked about. But the things that would work best in Butte County, so at the community level, having complete bicycle and pedestrian networks, so that when you're thinking about trying to get between any origin destination, that the network doesn't prevent you from wanting to travel. So having the complete bike and ped network, we can show what that effect is. Increasing transit frequency can make a real difference. Things like car sharing, where basically in some communities you can put in car share. It avoids people having to buy their own cars, and they only use them when they need them, so their total vehicle travel is lower. School pools for schools, that's something that has been demonstrated to reduce the number of vehicle trips to a campus. You can imagine how that might work. But again, those are the community scale and not something that an individual project can do on its own. The more individual strategies that would probably be most effective, land use diversity, you saw in those couple of projects in the cases like Stonegate, getting the land use diversity right. There's almost an optimum level considering the project site and what's around it. This is a real important aspect of trying to make sure you don't oversupply land uses that maybe would be too much and not have enough of another. So this gets to your residential and retail and work-related land use mix. Ride-sharing programs, especially if you're at a work location, an office building type project. Same thing for end-of-trip bicycle facilities, things that make it more convenient to either share rides or use something like a bicycle. Same thing for transit passes, subsidizing transit passes. Kind of a unique project we're doing in LA right now. LA Metro already has a program where anybody can sponsor a transit pass subsidy for students or for workers. So literally a developer could write a check and buy a set number of transit passes and target a specific school, for example. That has some equity components that if there are underserved areas or schools that have disadvantaged or minority students that you're trying to improve their ability to travel around the community, you can kind of solve two different problems at the same time here by providing those transit passes in a targeted way. And then telecommuting and alternative work schedules. These are effective, but they're hard to dictate at the entitlement stage for a land use project. So that's something to keep in mind. Also, telecommute or telework, as we're referring to it now. Let's just say not all the research is in yet. We're finishing up some right now where we're looking at surveys, household surveys prior to COVID that actually look at someone's travel patterns at the worker level and the household level. And what we're finding is that if you offer someone telework as an option, the household VMT may actually go up. If you think about not having to be at your, let's say you're at your desk for 8 hours a day, all 5 days of the week, and instead you're only there 3 days a week and you get 2 days to work from home, that provides you some additional flexibility in your schedule. And you may choose to do some extra errands. Maybe you take the kids to soccer practice. What our survey evidence is showing is that unless the person works from home all 5 days of the week, VMT is higher for the household. So this is an important distinction between just looking at an individual worker. Yeah, if you have an individual worker, you might find that they've reduced their VMT, but you have to think about the entire household and the household dynamic. So still a lot of research on this subject, and with post-COVID, we're going to see probably more of this. And I've got additional data I can share with you if you're interested in it. Other things that employers can do, just marketing of commute alternatives. Sometimes the reason people aren't choosing to do something different than drive is that they just don't know. They don't have information. Also, employer sponsored van pools or shuttles, so they're absorbing the cost of that travel option and trying to make it a little more convenient to share a ride. And then parking management in a variety of forms. One of the fundamental things that you have to think about with things like VMT is if you want to reduce vehicle travel, the very simple nature of travel behavior is you got to make it more costly to use the vehicle, whether that's things like gas taxes, VMT taxes, tolls, or parking costs. Or you have to find a way to make use of transit, walking, bicycling, scootering more convenient or lower cost. That's an and/or. And so parking management and making sure that you've thought through all the options you have available to yourselves in different individual jurisdictions to manage either the supply or the cost. Sometimes restricting the supply is like affecting the cost. So these are things that are available to you. They may not all be feasible in your jurisdiction, but this is a scan that we did based largely on the land use context, being a little bit more suburban or rural. So you don't see a lot of the more urban or real city, large city focused type strategies in the list. Next thing to consider is, do you really want to mitigate project by project in an ad hoc way? It's time consuming, it's got limited effectiveness, and it doesn't help the developer or project applicant understand what their costs are going to be if they have a VMT impact because of that ad hoc nature. So a lot of jurisdictions are looking to VMT-based impact fee programs or the concept of a mitigation bank or exchange. We've worked on a couple of different projects now looking at this, and there's a white paper too that we can share with you that highlight what these concepts are. We've got a couple of impact fees already in place. One we did for City of LA and one for the City of Orange, if anybody wants to actually read a Nexus study on how you do this. And then we have a new document coming out for the City of LA project. We're just wrapping up on how to actually implement the banker exchange. So if anybody wants more details, I can provide those here in just a few weeks. There are a lot of pros and cons to the program-based approach. What I can tell you generally, though, is a program-based approach has a lot of benefits because of the fact that you can build community scale VMT reducing projects or actions that are hard to do or impossible to do at the local project site level. Two, the program, if you design it right, tells the developer up front what their costs are. So if you have impact fees, for example. So I'll get into all the details here, but there is some real benefits to thinking about a program type concept. Now, one thing I wanted to sneak in here as part of all of this is that one of the other documents Brian sent out to you was the plan policy recommendation. And this was based on our early review of your general plans, for example, climate action plans, and how to deal with the fact that if you follow the OPR technical advisory, especially their thresholds, many of your projects are likely to have significant VMT impacts, and they'll be difficult to mitigate for the reasons I just cited. So what do you do if you're trying to avoid doing an EIR on almost every project that doesn't get screened out? This particular document lays out a potential CEQA strategy, taking advantage of the section 15183 exemption in CEQA. What this basically says is that projects that are consistent with a general plan that's already addressed the impacts adequately does not require that further additional impact analysis. And so we're working with a number of suburban agencies right now taking this approach to make it explicit that they want to take advantage of 15183. They'll deal with the VMT impact at the general plan level and then mitigate to the extent feasible, probably end up with a significant unavoidable impact. And then that allows for those subsequent projects to tier directly from that general plan EIR. So something to pay attention to if especially your development community is concerned about that. All right, the VMT impact screening tool. This is intended to make your lives easier. So BCAG, as part of our original scope here, wanted to take what is really output from the travel demand model and make it simpler and easier to access so you can do these types of screening tests on your own. This is the link, and I think Brian will send it out to you. But it is a tool that is relatively simple to use, and we'll pull it up here. Hope everyone still sees my screen. So it has a little splash screen giving you all the fun legal stuff. You can ignore that, just move on.
Hey, Ron, we're still seeing the presentation, or at least I am. Yeah.
Okay, we'll do a new share. That one working, Brian? One more time.
There we go.
All right. So yeah, get through the splash screen. And basically what this is a series of GIS layers containing all types of information from the model, as well as from your land use. So what you do with this particular screening tool, it's really designed to screen out the residential and office or work related land uses. So as you zoom in here, the parcel layer comes up. So the idea is city staff, county staff, or an applicant potentially can come in here and do a very quick assessment. And this is kind of what the state OPR had in mind when they were thinking about this shift to VMT. Is not only did they want to change the metric and make sure they were thinking about environmental impacts in the right context. Before we thought about the impacts to drivers, now we're thinking about the impact of driving. So they not only want to make that shift, but they also wanted to make the analysis, frankly, more streamlined for the projects that are in the right location based on the statutory objectives of 743. That's that encourage infill, promote active transportation, and reduce greenhouse gases. So this is what they had envisioned. The way this works is you basically decide you're going to add parcels to the analysis. You select a parcel. You continue the criteria. We have 3 different metrics. We have the home-based work VMT per worker if you're doing, let's say, an office project. Let's do a residential project. We have the home-based VMT per resident here. The other one is total VMT per service population. This would typically be used only if you're doing a large area plan, like a specific plan. And you can select multiple parcels if you were trying to do a specific plan. Next, you pick a baseline year. Now, the BCAG model has a base year of 2018, forecast years for 2020 and 2040. And after the post-campfire, they'll have an update to 2020, and they'll have additional interim years. What we've done is, because baseline in CEQA is very specific to the year the NOP was released or when you commenced your environmental analysis, we didn't want you to be stuck with just a 2020 value or a 2040 value. So you can interpolate anywhere along this linear line between 2020 and 2040. And that's all it's doing, is taking an interpolated value so you can assess your baseline a little more accurately. Because VMT trends over time do change, and so you want to capture that in the analysis. You do get a choice of threshold. What we've pre-programmed here, the OPR 15% below the region average, and then in our threshold memo we talked about the ARB recommendations, 16.8 for passenger vehicle VMT or 14.3 for total VMT. The output that we're sharing here for residential is based on the passenger vehicle VMT. So if we wanted to pick that one, we could. There is a small runtime, and this is where the model is basically taking that parcel layer and it's going in and doing an intersect with this larger TAZ data and saying, hey, my parcel sits within this TAZ, and I need this particular metric, this home-based VMT per resident, and I need to compare it to the threshold. The threshold's based on an interpolated value, 2021, and please go do all the math for me and then produce a little summary result. So this is what you get. It gives you some basic information of what you've selected up here, shows you your project location, shows you whether or not it's within a low VMT zone, which in this case it is. Gives you an indication that you've passed that screening test. Gives you some additional details. So let's say it didn't pass and you actually needed to do some mitigation. Well, this is where you'd get information on what that particular TAZ generates for VMT output. So currently it generates 12.3 VMT, home-based VMT per resident. So that value is the number you'd be using as part of your mitigation approach. So anyway, in this particular test though, it's well below the threshold, which is this 16.8% below the 19.6 BCAG region average. And then it gives you a little chart here to show you how far below you are. And like I said, you can pick one or more parcels to run at the same time. This particular document can be exported out. And this is just one way you can do this type of screening. This particular tool will be transferred to BCAG to be hosted by Chico State. So anytime that you need to access it, you know, it can be set up like this, where it's just a simple web link. Anybody can access it. It's pretty simple to use. If data changes, what we've done is set up the BCAG model to automate the output file that goes into this. So let's say BCAG does an update to their model, and now we have a 2025 forecast, and we want to add that. That's a file that kind of just slips in to the background that everybody has access to. I did want to highlight, though, that this is not the only screening tool. What I said earlier about screening is you're trying to obtain just enough evidence to feel comfortable making a presumption of less than significant. So there are some new tools that are being developed right now today. And Gordon did a nice job of introducing Replica. So I'll show you one other thing that Replica is working on with the state. This is mapping VMT in California. So it's a statewide map of VMT by block group. And the Replica data right now extends as far back in time as like 2018, 2019, and then it's up to date to the current year based on the current quarter, more or less. So this is data that could be more current depending on how far away we get from 2020. So let's say we're out in 2024 and you're trying to do a screening, and you didn't want to just use linear interpolation. You wanted to see if some things changed. Maybe fuel prices went way up, and you know VMT has changed dramatically. If Replica maintains this data, which that's up to them and the state to figure out, you'd be able to come in here and there would be the data for a particular block group. Slightly different metric, daily VMT per person and daily VMT per household so far as what they're producing. But the idea is the same. You're trying to obtain evidence as to what the performance is of a particular zone or area. So to the extent that this type of data is evolving and is, this is just one of many of the vendors that we're working with on this concept of statewide data. Streetlight has a statewide map as well. So lots of different options out there, but the one that we've created here is driven by the BCAG RTP SCS model. And that model was specifically calibrated and validated to Butte County. So there's some benefits to that. And finally, coming back to our presentation here, only a couple of other things I wanted to highlight. Just in this what's next, are you able to see this one now, Brian?
No, we're still seeing the screening tool.
Okay, we'll do a new share. You're back?
There we go.
Yeah. So this final document package is really an assembly of all the previous documents you guys have already seen, but I will be adding an executive summary to it with anybody that needs to quickly understand what we've done and what the recommendations are. That will be available to you. The screening tool at some point, as we transfer it to Chico State, will go live, and it's up to BCAG here as the owner of that tool, working with its member agencies to decide exactly how you guys want to set up the access to that. Other tools we've created are open to the public. Some are only open to the agency staff. So that's up to you guys to figure out. We will be presenting the final package to the BCAG board meeting, but we wanted to emphasize that that is a meeting just to inform them of what we did and for them to accept the study and the screening tool. What comes after that is this bullet here, lead agency decisions. Every lead agency has to make their own decisions about what your methodology is, what your metrics are, what your thresholds are, and what your feasible mitigation actions are. All the heavy lifting that the BCAG's done through this study is to help you get started and to provide you kind of the best available evidence that we could during this particular time. This VMT stuff is evolving pretty quickly, so if you check back 6 months from now, there's probably something new. But the idea here is we're not telling you what to do. We're trying to give you advice as to, well, here's the range of options for you. Here's what the state has constructed. And here's your flexibility given the way the CEQA guidelines are constructed is you have a lot of discretion to decide for yourselves what your methodology is, what thresholds you want to use. You always have to support your decisions with substantial evidence, but there is more flexibility than just following the OPR technical advisory to the letter. With that, Brian, we can go to